Before this video starts, if you enjoy this video, there are many more like it already on the channel with many more like it to come in the future, so subscribe. I am trying to hit 125,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so I would really appreciate it. I upload daily on this channel, so if you're looking for some consistent basketball talk, this is the place for it. Also, drop a like on this video, it only takes 1 second, it makes a massive difference. As we all know, the Los Angeles Clippers in the second round versus the Denver Nuggets choked harder than that girl in the Suns' hotel room. A team previously in the conversation for the top contenders in the 2020 season ousted in the second round versus a team that everyone across the board considered inferior. And with the contract situation in Los Angeles, the Clippers really have their backs against the wall. PG and Kawhi are both on one-year deals, so if they don't win a championship in the 2021 season, there's a high likelihood that they both walk, which would obviously completely fuck over this franchise as they traded basically all of their first-round picks to make this duo happen. So if this duo leaves, you are suddenly very bad and you don't have any first-round picks to make up for that. The Clippers are in a tough spot and they have to make every move precisely to ensure a championship in 2021 because it will all come crashing down if they don't. So today I wanted to lay out my plan for the Clippers, what I would do in the shoes of Jerry West to get this team a championship in 2021 to help them keep Kawhi and Paul George, or at the very least get them a conference finals appearance for God's sakes. About a week and a half ago, I made a video on why the Clippers should fire Doc Rivers, and to my surprise, they actually did it. I predicted at the end of that video that they would hold on to him, but they didn't. And to me, that's a good move. However, it only becomes a good move really when you find a good replacement. You can't flub this one. In the coaching conversation, it is difficult to say who the best guys are who we haven't seen before. Of course, there is Kenny Atkinson or Dave Yeager. I've heard good things about Wes Unseld Jr., but really it's up to the Clippers management to find the right guy. But what I can give you is what the criteria for the best coach should be. Whoever they hire needs to be a guy who is A, good at managing egos, and B, really good at X's and O's, because the biggest issue for the Los Angeles Clippers this year outside of those egos and chemistry issues is their horrible offensive system that was so simplistic it fell apart. A coach who knows how to run a system that has a lot of off-ball movement and just more complicated than what the Clippers were doing, that'd be fantastic. Step 2 is considering a Paul George trade. Now, I'm saying consider for a reason, not just straight up trade him, because the move has to be right. You can't just trade him for the sake of trading him. As for why I have Paul George in a Nets jersey in the thumbnail, I've had a 3-team trade in mind in the event that James Harden demands a trade where the Nets send Houston, Karis LeVert, and some stuff. The Clippers send Brooklyn Paul George to be the perfect third guy to KD and Kyrie, and they send Harden to LA. Now, I think you can get more for James Harden than just Karis LeVert, but this is in a situation where James Harden's like, get me to one of the LA teams, which I could see happening. As for why the Clippers would make this trade, well, even though James Harden's also known to kind of stink it up in the playoffs, his stinking it up in the playoffs is still way better than James Harden. His stinking it up in the playoffs is still way better than Paul George. Paul George is, fuck me, you know what I'm trying to say. Also, I think Harden in a system that would get him moving off ball would be fantastic. He could be the lead ball handler, but still let Kawhi Leonard do Kawhi Leonard things. Also, the Clippers need playmaking, which I'll talk about in a second, and he would really fix that. This, however, is only in the event that James Harden demands a trade, and I don't see that happening this season. I could see it happening next, but by then, Kawhi and Paul George are free agents, so it doesn't much matter. Another thing that I thought of was Paul George for one of Ben Simmons or Joel Embiid. If the Sixers are desperate for a star who plays well off of one of those two, PG is it. Both of those guys would bring very different circumstances with them, and in the position of the Clippers, I'd prefer Embiid just because I don't know that Ben Simmons is any better than Paul George in the playoffs. Thus far, Ben has been very iffy in the playoffs. But yeah, those are all things that should be considered, but don't be hasty and just make a trade for pennies on the dollar just for the sake of doing it. I know everyone's freaking out about how bad Paul George was in the playoffs, and rightfully so, but at the end of the day, he's still a good player, and you shouldn't trade a good player who might suck in the playoffs for okay players who definitely will. or at the best will just be okay. But really, in terms of more realistic acquisitions, because all those trades I laid out are probably not going to happen, it's kind of rough for the Clippers because they're in a tough situation. There are some ideas, but the actual prospects and the actual completing those ideas is not as easy. Let me explain. Montrezl Harrell is a pretty damn good player. However, I don't think he is really that good for the Clippers. If anything, the value of Harrell for the Clippers stems from an inherent weakness in the team, which is simplistic offense. A good coach who knows his X's and O's would solve that issue, so Harrell's value would decrease quite a bit for this team. However, because Harrell is a pretty damn good offensive player, especially in the pick and roll, he's a very good energy guy, and he's just hitting his prime, there are a lot of teams interested in him. Really, the main two are the Raptors and the Miami Heat, or really, those are just the two most important ones. There's a third team that I'm going to mention after. That one's a little bit more of a stretch. This is a tricky situation because you could do a sign and trade to those teams for one of their point guards if they were up for that. The issue is both of those point guards are unrestricted free agents, so they'd also want to be heading to the Clippers, which I think is reasonably possible, but not a guarantee. Either Goran Dragic or Fred VanVleet, which is tricky because they're both free agents, as I said, so both players would have to agree. But if you can make it work, then this one is a slam dunk. There's also a world where you just simply let Harrell walk and one of those two agree to become Clippers. It really just depends on how they're feeling. But I think the trade, if it happened for either of those teams, would be mutually beneficial. I actually think Harrell's a downgrade for both of those players, but because Fred is a free agent, unrestricted, same for Dragic, I think they could want to work out that trade. Another option, and like I said, this one is a stretch, but if you could make it happen, it'd be huge, would be trading Montrezl Harrell to the Indiana Pacers for Malcolm Brogdon. This move would be huge for the Clippers. Unfortunately, it's not a likely one. While Victor Oladipo and Miles Turner do seem to want out of Indiana, it seems doubtful that the Pacers will blow it up, being that they're a small market team. Brogdon, TJ Warren, and Domantas Sabonis are good enough to keep your head above water in the Eastern Conference, but if the Pacers did decide to hit the reset button, which could be a financial issue for them, but if they did, Harrell isn't a bad return for Brogdon. Not the best, but not bad. Brogdon would honestly save the Clippers, in my opinion, and even you could, if you wanted to be a little bit nicer and give the Pacers a bit more, you could also throw in Landry Shamet, who's like 23 years old. But there are also other point guards out there who can play make. My main suggestion would just be trade Harrell in a sign and trade for one point guard who can really play make and is like a good starter level player. Unfortunately, there is not a clear-cut, very realistic answer, but that is something that I would consider strongly. And because Jerry West is a better GM than he was player, I could see him doing that. And that's saying a lot because he was a damn good player. So I think he could work something out because he seems to be a genie with this shit. Also, getting Harrell frees up more minutes for Zubac, which I think is a good thing. He especially showed that in the playoffs this year. The guy is just an all-around solid player on both ends of the court, very good rebounder, and while he isn't all that versatile defensively, he can defend the post and protect the paint, which are the two most important things for a big man. To get a good idea of how good of a rebounder Zubac is, he averaged 15 boards a game per 36, 7.5 in just 18 minutes a game. More Zubac and trading Harrell for a good starting point guard who can play make would be huge for the Clippers. Now let's talk about some moves that are a little bit smaller in scale. First of all, the Clippers should prioritize re-signing JaMychal Green over Marcus Morris. Marcus might be a better player, but not for this team. Morris will demand a bigger bag while being worse for the team. You could bring back Green for like $5 million a year. No way in hell is Morris's egotistical ass taking that. I don't care for Marcus Morris if you couldn't tell. But JaMychal Green is about equal as a spot-up three-point shooter, a little bit better defensively, and he doesn't shoot the ball 15 times a game like he's a star player. Guy knows his role. And yes, I am fully aware that there were many games in this year's playoffs where Marcus Morris was the second best player on the Clippers. However, that is more of an indictment on Paul George, Lou Williams, and Montrezl Harrell than it is a compliment to Marcus Morris. And either way, even if he is usually making his shots, I don't want Marcus Morris taking 15 shots a game, point blank period. So Green over Morris, you save some money that way, and I think you hold on to the better player. What else? Well, you need a backup big man to replace Montrezl Harrell. And I would highly recommend Mason Plumlee. I think he is underrated as a backup center. Good defender, solid enough finisher, and also on offense, the guy is like a really good passing big, which I do think is ironic being that he is a backup to Jokic, but he averages 2.5 assists a game in 17 minutes, which is 5 per 36. And that's not Denver's system. He's had seasons with these numbers in the past. He had one with the Portland Trailblazers where he averaged 5 per 36. So Plumlee is really solid. I could actually see him and Zubac like 60-40ing the minutes, Zubac being more of a defensive guy and Plumlee being a little bit better offensively, and I think that works out well. Also, that adds to the playmaking. That amends the playmaking issue a little bit. Now, I don't think a center who averages 2.5 assists is going to solve your passing issues, but it's nice to have another guy who's not going to be a black hole, like Montrezl Harrell. I'm not saying Plumlee is going to be some big initiator, but a couple backdoor passes a game, like 2 or 3, is a nice thing to have in your back pocket. As for some smaller moves, guys you could get on some relatively cheap deals, I'd sign guys like Brandon Knight, who can be a shooter, Damari Carroll, who can be a 3-and-D guy. I'm going to keep recommending the Jeff Green gamble based on how well he played for the Rockets in the playoffs this year, but these moves don't really matter all that much. The Clippers luckily do have some cap space, but their backs are again against the wall with the impending free agency of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. Mostly Kawhi, because if Paul George left and Kawhi stayed, it wouldn't be like, oh no. But you know, if one goes, the other probably does, so you get what I mean. So in summary, you need to nail the replacement for Doc Rivers. I've actually seen some people suggest Phil Jackson, which is interesting. I'd like to see that just because, hey, it's Phil Jackson. He's back in the NBA. But I doubt that's going to happen. He's good at managing egos, but he's like 90 now. See what the trade market is for Paul George. If the trade is there, pull the trigger, but also don't be too hasty. Sign and trade Montrezl Harrell for a point guard who can play make, and then sign Mason Plumlee so he and Zubac can fill the backup and starting center minutes. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The talent is there. It just needs to be managed better by coaching, some more playmaking, and adjustments do need to be made. And I hope the Clippers do make these adjustments. It seems like they will based on them firing Doc Rivers, but they have to nail this one, because if not, this franchise is fucked. If you want to support this content outside of just your like and subscription, I do have a Patreon, so go check that out. Link will be in the description. Extra content and a Discord server over there. And that is the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content like this, and keep the outro music.